Hey guys, so thanks for sticking it out for those long and boring videos. We finally made it to the end. I know it says history and prospects at the top, but it's more like conclusion, history and prospects. Okay, so before we go on to the rest of the video, I figured this is a good place to recap some of the, or at least what I feel, the most important concepts in the series were. The first being that prosperity is the meeting place or the crossroads between high incomes and low prices. Capital's veto power is a formative principle in international trade, meaning the more freedom that capital has to locate itself and relocate itself all around the world in response to changing economic conditions, the greater the power it has to either reward or punish a country based on its economic policies. So if there was a country that decided that it was going to put strict regulations on the environment and was going to let or help workers form unions, so basically, some things that might help people in the country, then the capital's veto power, they could use that to punish the country by withholding the capital, reducing the country's capital supply, and moving abroad to another country, maybe like China or India, where people get paid slave wages, basically, in those countries. Okay, and then private money creation as a tax on the money supply. This is a massive installed financial rent, source of financial instability and other ills. So that's pretty important also. As a source of financial instability, it makes the entire money supply vulnerable to just disintegration. Land as a unique factor, highly sensitive to changes in demand. Investment decisions, let alone, meaning not tampered with, are not necessarily made on a macroeconomically expedient basis. So yeah, I mean, the way that credit is allocated in our current system, although it might be the most profitable and risk-free to those doing the lending or doing the investing, it's not necessarily what's best for the economy as a whole. And in fact, the investments that are best for the economy as a whole are actually long-term business investments that are definitely subject to uncertainty. And those are mostly exactly the type of investments that aren't being made, because most banks are lending for mortgages, they're lending for consumption credit, or they're lending to people who engage in speculations in asset prices or real estate prices or something like that. And labor as a factor with negligible bargaining power. So yeah, as long as there's unemployment, then labor has relatively little bargaining power, and if people are ever in a desperate situation en masse, like the way they were in China when the Three Gorges Dam required the eviction and homelessness of hundreds of thousands or even millions of Chinese people, you can see the fruits of that action by a massively downward pressure on the labor market. So yeah, I think that's it in terms of recapping. I guess for land we didn't really say enough about that, but we should remember with land, it's infungible, immobile, fixed in supply, and indispensable to all business enterprises. And also, we should remember that due to the price elasticities of supply and demand in the housing market and in the rental market, that taxation upon land values would not fall on tenants or on renters, but it would fall on the people, on the landlords, basically. Okay. So yeah, in order for the economy to keep functioning as it has in the past and how it is expected to continue, these issues within the economy must be addressed. Left ignored, they will undermine the basis of the model of the fortunate society that Western civilization has enjoyed for the recent past. Large middle classes with the economy based on mass consumption. What will it turn into without these points being addressed? Probably an economy of luxury consumption, as the market for mass consumption will have been whittled down, and the two classes remaining are upper class and lower class. So no more middle class. So yeah, we've talked a lot about a bunch of different ideas like credit allocation, investment decisions, trade policy, monetary policy, etc. But how have these ideas manifested in the past? Well, I think Japan is a great example. It's a great example as a success story of a dirigist model, a protectionist model of political economy. So, in post-war Japan, when the political leadership there was essentially given free rein by the American government, insofar as it continued to be actively anti-communist on the international scene, a heavily dirigist economic model was pursued, where the central bank had control over the banking sector using a tool called window guidance. In this window guidance, essentially, the central bank gave the private banks credit quotas to reach every quarter. And they also kind of had control over what the banks were supposed to lend into also. Additionally, Japan's industrial sector was protected, subsidized, and finally cartelized when their intranational competition became too fierce, and Japan's economic leadership knew that this competition ought to be directed instead internationally. So yeah, basically what happened in Japan was their companies were so competitive with each other that they weren't paying attention to profit margins at all. They were only competing on the basis of gaining market share. So Japan's various industrial firms were completely focused on output and not necessarily on profits. So the way they were competing, they were actually destroying themselves. And so the Japanese government stepped in, cartelized these firms, created a hierarchy between them, and from then on they would operate on the basis of cooperation rather than competition with each other. But they were still going to compete internationally. So they were still going to be subject to the pressures of international competition, but now they would all kind of be on each other's side, or at least officially, maybe not behind the scenes. But anyways, this model of long-term credit directed towards business and industrial purposes, combined with a protectionist and dirigist model for the firms themselves, made Japan the most internationally competitive company in the world. Japanese manufacturing firms ferociously swallowed up market share. They did so especially in America, where perhaps Japan was given access to the American domestic market in return for the promise of loyalty in the anti-communist struggle. America then would have been trading an increment of her long-term prosperity in return for foreign policy goals, which is not really an unheard of bargain. So yeah, Japan's economic success story was huge, but unfortunately, in the 80s and the 90s, this system of credit window guidance was abused, and The banks were made to overinflate, and since industry was completely saturated with debt and credit, um, credit was instead directed into real estate. And if you read Richard Werner's book called Princes of the Yen, it's a very interesting history of the modern Japanese economy. Well, what about America? Though the United States often presents itself as the champion of laissez-faire economic policy, protectionism and dirigism are rooted firmly in the country's intellectual history. America emerged as one of the first antagonists and competitors to Great Britain's system of importing raw materials from colonies and transforming them domestically with the aid of her manufacturers to resell them abroad. America rejected the suggestions of Britain's myriad political economists and their consensus that prosperity cannot be increased by using government policy to defy the self-affirming logic of pre-existing economic relations. The system of internal improvements, trade protections, and credit guided toward long-term investments by central authority became known domestically and internationally as the American system of political economy. This was closely mirrored by the emergence of an analogous perspective on political economy in Germany, with Friedrich List's publication of the National System of Economy, which proved to be immensely influential in the molding of the German economic success. There are a couple of names that were involved in the founding of the American system, but Henry Clay is really a big one. He was the main sort of American statesman at the forefront advocating a system of internal improvements, which today we would call infrastructure spending. So he called for internal improvements, trade protections, and credit guidance. So Germany and America thus share a common strain in the arc of their 19th century ascensions. Both of them invented the economic rationale of a national system before they put it to practice in order to usurp Britain's rule as the uncontested master in international trade. So that's kind of cool. Both of them had the idea. They were sick of this British economic hegemony, and so lots of writers and great thinkers in these countries were probably dedicating a lot of their mental energies towards this question, and they both came up with a similar answer, which is basically the dirigist model of economy, the American system, protectionism, whatever you want to call it. It's basically comprised of all the same elements. Poland. Poland is not such a happy story in comparison to the other two. Poland is basically the poster child for the neoliberal reform movement. So basically Poland is what you get if you listen to people at The Economist, if you listen to people at the IMF, if you listen to people at the Wall Street Journal. It's what happens when you listen to the people telling you to get rid of all your trade protections, allow your currency to accumulate value, do all these things to sort of integrate with arms wide open into the international market. During the transitional period where the Soviet or Eastern Bloc economies changed into market economies, the governments were all advised to pursue a singular path of economic reform. Trade and capital liberalization, privatization of state-owned enterprise, cutting government spending, devaluing labor, and so on. So devaluing labor meant like busting up unions, cutting government spending. They recommended to reduce national debts, but also to make the currency appreciate on the foreign exchange markets. And this would supposedly make the transition speedy and encourage investment into those countries. All of them followed this advice, but as the human cost was too great on the population, many governments soon switched over to a more centrist way of governance. Poland, however, stayed true to the course and that experienced much GDP growth during this period. It was touted as an economic miracle, and in some respects it was. In other respects, however, it spelled the death of the country. Looking at the above graph, we see 25 years of economic activity in which the unemployment rate was only ever underneath 10% for maybe just 3 years. Since we know that desperation is an indicator of wages because of its role in determining bargaining power in the labor market, we know from the onset that wages have been very low for this period. We can also see that starting in the second half of the 2000s, unemployment finally started to come down. This isn't because of rising wages or better business prospects or anything like that. This is because the young people of Poland finally tired of the powerless way of life that their country had been reduced to and decided en masse to emigrate to the United Kingdom. Poland is an excellent example of what happens when you follow the free trade, hard money policy prescriptions. Industry becomes unprofitable in comparison to other countries because of the economic policy that you take. The industry closes down, income streams close down, local businesses have no one to sell to, and the country continues to shrink as it has lost its engine of income. In addition to all of that, when your industries become unprofitable and they shut down or move abroad, neoliberal economists often say, well, that's okay because when your currency appreciates, it's going to attract capital into your country, which is a good thing because you'll have a nice big supply of capital in your country. Well, the thing is that when you take on free trade and hard money, it means that there is no way for businesses to be profitable in your country, let alone become major exporters. So what is the capital going to do once it gets into your country? Is it going to go into industry and production and things like, actually like manufacturing things? Or is it going to go into finance and real estate? And that's exactly what it does do when you follow these prescriptions of free trade and hard money and so on. The capital in the Polish economy went straight into finance and real estate, which drove up the cost of housing while simultaneously depriving industry of the credit that it needed to expand. This spelled a very bad situation for the people of Poland in terms of their standard of living. So, if you're listening to neoliberal economists who tell you that it's okay if your businesses all shut down because of these reforms, it's okay because a lot of capital is going to come into your country and then start up new businesses. But the thing is, after you follow these policies, there's no avenue for the capital to go down. The only avenue thus then becomes investing in real estate and finance, which, as we know, have a very weak effect on demand in the country, but they have a strong effect in raising the cost of living by inflating land prices. So yeah, not a good model for an economy, at least not in my opinion. Okay. So, prospects for the future of the middle class economy model, I'm speaking in general now, not just about Poland, appear negative, as the economic consensus globally continues to push for free trade bills. This means that the global veto power of capital is only expected to increase, and issues of political economy will be decided to an even greater extent by special interests. Whatever economic proposals there are that seek to preserve the middle class in Western civilization are not directed toward reclaiming the power of money creation or even of the state's power to direct capital toward more long-term investments. They're mostly based on schemes of increased taxation on the upper class. While this satisfies populist sentiment, it's an economically insufficient proposal. It doesn't actually alter the functioning of the economy to return it to such patterns of production as produced the middle class earlier in the 20th century. The factors which contributed to the growth of the middle class society in the middle of the 20th century were these: high growth potential, partially due to the destruction of the wars, and partially due to the greater technological advancements; a relatively fixed system of international trade and capital flows; an international consensus of agreement with the basic principles of Keynesian countercyclical policy, and the importance of maintaining high labor-derived incomes. Okay, so this is what happened in the period basically from the 50s to the 80s. There was high growth potential because everything was destroyed, so there was basically high demand for growth, which meant that a lot of businesses could grow and expand and become profitable in a very short amount of time, even if the level of wealth was extremely low at this point. It meant that businesses could expand quickly. So yes, I realize this is the broken window fallacy or whatever, but there is a kernel of truth to that. A relatively fixed system of international trade and capital flows. Yeah, so during this period, foreign exchange rates were fixed during the Bretton Woods period, which meant that governments couldn't use monetary policy as a sort of backdoor trade policy to try to devalue their exports and appreciate their exports. This kept things on sort of an even footing, and people didn't have to be so afraid, really, I guess, of the pressures of international trade. There was an international consensus of agreement with the basic principles of Keynesian countercyclical policy and the importance of maintaining high labor-derived incomes. Yeah, I mean, during this period, monetary policy was generally loose, and it was generally directed into industry, which was a pretty good thing because it meant that debt as a share of the economy was kept pretty low, even if it meant that it would expand it. And it meant that if labor-derived incomes were high, then sales were high, and it would just kind of move in a virtuous circle. Yeah, but in terms of policies, these ideas were largely overturned in the 1980s by economists and politicians who yearned for the politics of anti-government and pro-business sentiment. So I'm talking about the General Pinochets, the Reagans, and the Thatchers of the world. Their legacy is one of cannibalistic growth, killing the goose that laid the golden eggs, so to speak. Hold on, I need to get my charger, or else the computer will go. So, okay, yeah. So since the 1980s, a lot of the things that contributed to the stability and growth of middle-class economies in the middle of the century period have been overturned. So, exchange rates between different countries are now floating rather than fixed, meaning that now countries are compelled by circumstance to use monetary policy as a backdoor trade policy, which leads to financial instability, as we covered earlier. What else? Regulations and restrictions on lending have been lifted, meaning that lots of the previous regulations that funneled credit into industry and business are now instead funneled into consumption credit, into land values, and into financial speculation. speculation in asset prices. So this has the double negative of driving up the costs of living while simultaneously depriving business of investment credit. And in addition to all of this, free trade, privatization, and union busting have all sort of become the flavor of the week ever since 1980. And so prospects for a middle-class society in the future appear negative, especially with the onset of rapidly increasing automation and shrinking demand for labor, mixed with an inadequate set of policy proposals in response to these phenomena. Prospects appear particularly negative for the American economy, since the American political parties are defined by their respective attitudes of pro-rentierism, the Republican Party, and anti-profits, the Democratic Party. What do I mean by pro-rentier? I mean pro-interest and pro-land rent. That's what the Republican Party represents. It doesn't necessarily represent pro-capital, because if it represented pro-capital values, it would mean representing protectionist or dirigist economic policy, but it doesn't. It's pro-free trade, which means opening up the domestic market to foreign competitors. So it's really not pro-capital as much as it is pro-rentier, which are the economic rents of land rent, and interest. So the only political mindset which is capable of enacting the policies which would address our current problems and sort of restore the patterns that produce middle-class economies would be one that takes a pro-capital and pro-labor but anti-rentier attitude, meaning one that supports the growth of domestic businesses and supports the growth of labor or wages as a share of incomes within the economy, but anti-rentier, meaning getting rid of unnecessary costs of living, getting rid of installed rents like interest burdens in the economy, getting rid of all of this basically financial parasitism. That's what I mean by an anti-rentier attitude. So, for an example, an anti-rentier attitude would manifest in directing credit away from land values and into businesses, or enacting monetary reform, which got rid of the interest burden on the monetary supply, things like that. Because with private money creation, there is a massive financial rent on money creation. So anyways, America is unfortunately ill-equipped for this, because the American political dichotomy is basically defined by both the slave morality and the master morality. The Republican Party represents the master morality, where basically the idea is that the lower classes are poor and stupid, therefore we are rich and smart, meaning that our attributes are a causality of their attributes. And the Democrat takes the inverse, because they are big bad bullies, we are pure innocent lambs. Again, it's the slave morality mindset, which means that our attributes are causally determined by their attributes. The American political establishment, the American political public dialogue, I guess, is firmly within the grips of this sort of mirror image system of politics. And there basically are no alternatives within the American political arena, which is really a shame, because it doesn't appear that there's any political faction alive anymore that could sort of address our current straits. I would say the last thing that we had maybe was someone like Eisenhower, um, but yeah, the American political dichotomy is basically between pro-rentierism and anti-labor, which is the Republican Party, which has a history of busting unions, and anti-profits, which is the Democratic Party, which really doesn't have any ideas or suggestions for structural economic reform. All it suggests is increasing taxes on the wealthy people of America and then redistributing it to people and, increasing welfare, so that it basically entrenches a system of parasitism rather than seeking to actually resolve it. So yeah, neither of those really present a very good path for the future of the country, unfortunately. Yeah, so everything laid out in this series of videos, talks, whatever you want to call them. I don't want to call them lectures, because it's just my perspective on economics. You don't have to take what I'm saying as law, but this is my perspective. It's just the set of conclusions that I've arrived at after having done some amateur research in this field. So, no, I didn't major in this field in college, but I was very curious about it, so I made sure to read lots and lots. If you're curious as to how I arrived at this perspective, the authors and economists whose ideas were used heavily in this series and who were influential to me personally are the following: George Knapp, Frederick Soddy, C.H. Douglas, Irving Fisher, Henry Simons, Arthur Kitson, Gottfried Feder. One might consider these the chartalists. These were the people who originally realized the issues inherent in a system of private money creation. George Knapp really first codified this by writing The State Theory of Money, which directly contradicted the then popular Mengerian theory of commodity money or emergent money. George Knapp's theory, his assertion was that money was a creature of the state and therefore was only properly issued publicly. Frederick Soddy, C.H. Douglas, Irving Fisher, Henry Simons were all very important people in the theory of drafting the Chicago Plan. Arthur Kitson popularized the pro-fiat currency perspective, criticized the gold standard as being inherently unstable and incapable of expanding at a sufficient rate per the needs of the money supply. Gottfried Feder talked a bit about seigniorage and how private money creation denied the state the seigniorage to which it was entitled, therefore necessitated that the government get its revenues through direct taxation, which is no good. Then there's Friedrich List, Henry Carey, Alexander Hamilton, Ian Fletcher, Eric Reinert, Ha-Joon Chung, Ralph Gomery, William Baumol. These are basically a bunch of dirigists and protectionists, and I found their perspectives very sort of challenging, actually, because for a long time I thought that free trade, while it might have some problems, was generally the best way to go about things, and reading these guys really sort of challenged my positions there. Friedrich List and Henry Carey, respectively German and American, they both basically invented the theories of protectionism in their own countries, along with Alexander Hamilton. whose report on manufacturers was highly influential in setting up the American system of tariffs. Ian Fletcher, he's just sort of a lobbyist for American Manufacturing Association, but he's wrote an excellent book called Free Trade Doesn't Work. If you want to read sort of a, I guess, biased and polemic reputation of free trade theory, you can read Ian Fletcher. Eric Reinert has a bit more of a nuanced perspective on trade. Same with Ralph Gummery and William Baumol. Hudjun Chang is in the same sort of polemic category as Ian Fletcher. Richard Werner is great if you want to read about Japan's monetary system and its trade system and how these things were subverted during the 1980s and how their original policies were actually quite effective, but then once it sort of accepted the neoliberal consensus, it really sort of lost its ability to guide itself with better outcomes. Werner Sombart, German economist, somewhat controversial. Henry George, of course, for his work on land values, land value taxation. David Ricardo and Adam Smith, because they're the sort of unavoidable classicists, and if you're talking anything economic, you're inevitably going to bump into them. Simon Patton, he was kind of a turn of the century American economist. Michael Hudson, Steve Keen, Bill Mitchell, and Martin Wolf are sort of prominent modern post-Keynesians. Some of them are pretty polemical, so if that's not your thing, you might want to avoid it. Yeah, I'd say they have some pretty informative writing. J.M. Keynes, another sort of ensconced name. You can't really go anywhere in economics without running into something that he's written. And then J.S. Mill and J.K. Galbraith. J.S. Mill is another classic, whereas Galbraith might not be considered a classic. I know my dad thinks that John Kenneth Galbraith is a communist, so I don't know. I definitely think that his book, The Affluent Society, is definitely worth a read, and it's all in all, I found it a pretty interesting perspective, and it's definitely formative to my own perspective. So yeah, I hope you liked this series of videos. I'm sorry if this last one was a little bit polemic. I was just kind of winding it up and trying to find the best way to put all these ideas together in such a way that they made sense. But yeah, thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope that you found the series, if not informative, at least interesting. Thanks.